It was supposed to be the perfect vacation. The sun was shining and the air was warm as the Thompson family drove down the quiet highway, heading toward a small town they had heard so much about. Their car was packed with bags, snacks, and a sense of excitement for what lay ahead. The kids, Billy and Emma, were playing games in the back seat while their parents, David and Sarah, chatted about the sights they wanted to see. David, a tall, calm man in his mid-40s, had always dreamed of taking his family on a road trip like this. He worked as a government agent, though his family had no idea about the details of his job. They had been on the road for hours and were now only a few miles away from their destination. Everything was going perfectly, but as they drove through the sleepy little town, everything changed. Suddenly, a squad car pulled up behind them, flashing its lights. David's heart skipped a beat. The road had been empty, and there was no reason for a police car to pull them over. He glanced at Sarah, who gave him a look of confusion. The kids stopped their game, sensing something wasn't right. David carefully slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road. The officer stepped out of the car, a tall man with a stern face. He approached the driver's side, his boots tapping on the pavement. David rolled down the window, his hands steady on the wheel. "License and registration," the officer said gruffly, not even greeting David. There was an edge in his voice, as though he had already decided something. David handed over his license and the car's registration, still confused. "Is there a problem, officer?" The cop didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a long look at David, his eyes narrowing. "Where are you headed?" David nodded towards the town ahead. "We're just passing through on vacation." The officer's eyes flicked over the family, then back to David. His face twisted slightly, as if he had already made up his mind. He leaned in closer to David, the smell of cheap cologne and fast food wafting through the open window. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." David blinked in surprise. "What? Why?" "We've had reports of people like you in the area," the officer said, his tone rising just slightly. He didn't explain further, just ordered David out of the car. David's heart began to pound in his chest. This wasn't normal. Something wasn't right. The officer had no reason to suspect them, no cause to stop them, but the look in the cop's eyes made it clear. He was looking for trouble, and the Thompson family was in his sights. Reluctantly, David opened the car door and stepped out. The officer gestured for him to stand beside the car. "Now, I want to make sure everything's in order here. You'll need to open the trunk." David did as he was told, his mind racing. Sarah looked at him with concern, her hands gripping the armrest. Billy and Emma were silent now, their faces showing confusion and fear. The officer rummaged through their things in the trunk, not speaking. David's mind was racing. This didn't feel right. It didn't feel like a routine traffic stop. His gut told him something was wrong, but he wasn't sure what it was. The officer slammed the trunk shut with a loud thud and turned back to David. His voice was now cold and harsh. "You're under arrest." David's heart stopped. "What? Arrest? What are you talking about?" "You're being detained for suspicion of illegal activity," the officer said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Step over. Here." David felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew that reacting too strongly could make the situation worse. The officer motioned for him to move to the back of the squad car, and David obeyed, though his mind was a whirlwind. Sarah had already unbuckled her seatbelt and was halfway out of the car when David turned to her, his voice low and steady. "Stay in the car. I'll be fine." But the officer wasn't having it. "No, ma'am. Everyone gets out of the vehicle." David's chest tightened. He could hear the fear in Sarah's voice as she tried to argue, but the officer wasn't listening. Billy and Emma were now visibly shaken, eyes wide with confusion, unsure of what was happening to their father. The officer had already begun to cuff David, his hands rough and uncaring. David's heart was racing, but he held it together. He wasn't going to lose control. "What's this about?" David asked again, his voice now firm. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he snapped, "Just get in the car." David was shoved into the back of the squad car, the door slamming shut behind him. He couldn't believe what was happening. His mind was spinning. What had started as an innocent family vacation was now spiraling into something far more dangerous. And as the officer got into the driver's seat, the car started moving, taking them away from the quiet town and straight into the unknown. David sat in the back of the squad car, his hands still cuffed, as the officer drove through the narrow streets of the town. The air inside the car felt heavy, the silence pressing down on him. He couldn't believe what was happening. His mind raced with questions. Why had they been pulled over in the first place? What did the officer mean by illegal activity? And why did the officer seem so determined to escalate things? The car made a sharp turn down a narrow alley, its tires skidding slightly on the gravel. David's pulse quickened. This was not normal procedure. They had passed the town's main street, now heading somewhere remote. The officer, who hadn't said a word since David had been shoved into the car, drove with an eerie calmness. It didn't feel like a routine arrest. It felt like something more sinister was happening. "Where are you taking us?" David finally asked, his voice steady, but laced with a growing sense of urgency. The officer didn't respond immediately. He just kept his eyes on the road, his grip tight on the steering wheel. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. David could feel the weight of his family's fear back at the car, Sarah, Billy, and Emma, still in the hands of the other officers. He had to do something, and fast. But what? As the car continued its winding path, David's thoughts went back to the peaceful drive they'd had before this nightmare began. How had everything changed so suddenly? Why had these officers singled them out? Was it because of the way they looked? The way they acted? Or was there something more to this? Something deeper and darker that he wasn't seeing yet? David's mind snapped back to the present when the squad car slowed to a stop. They were now in a secluded area on the edge of the town, surrounded by tall trees. There were no other cars, no people in sight. The officer put the car in park, but didn't turn off the engine. "Get out," the officer said finally, his voice cold. David hesitated for a moment, then obeyed. The officer's eyes followed his every move, like a predator watching its prey. As soon as David stepped out of the car, the officer roughly grabbed his arm, leading him toward a small, run-down building nearby. It looked like an abandoned warehouse. The air smelled musty, and there was a sense of unease in the atmosphere. "What is this place?" David asked, trying to steady his breathing. He didn't like the direction things were going. Every instinct. He had told him that something wasn't right, and the officer's behavior only added to the growing tension. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he opened the door to the building and shoved David inside. The inside was dim, lit only by a few flickering lights hanging from the ceiling. There were no windows, just cold, concrete walls. The air felt thick, heavy with the staleness of disuse. It was the kind of place that made David's stomach turn. Inside, 2 more officers were waiting. They looked at David with cold, calculating eyes. Their uniforms were crisp, but their expressions were anything but welcoming. One of them stepped forward, a man with a scar running down his cheek. "Sit down," the officer ordered, pointing to a rusty chair in the center of the room. David didn't move. He wasn't going to let them intimidate him. "I don't know what this is about, but you have no right to keep me here. I haven't done anything wrong," David said, his voice firm but controlled. The officer with the scar smirked. "You don't get to tell us what to do. You're not in control here, agent." The use of the word agent was like a slap to David's face. The officer knew exactly who he was. But why hadn't they recognized him before? David's mind raced. How had they known he was an FBI agent? Was this all a setup? Were they targeting him? Or was this a mistake that had spiraled out of control? The scarred officer circled him slowly, like a lion sizing up its prey. "You're going to tell us everything. About who you work for, about what you're really doing here. We don't trust outsiders, especially government agents." David's thoughts were sharp. He had to play his cards carefully. His FBI training had taught him how to handle tense situations like this, but this wasn't just any case. He could feel the weight of his family's safety hanging over him. If these officers were willing to go this far, he couldn't let his guard down. "I'm not telling you anything until I speak to my lawyer," David said, keeping his voice steady. The scarred officer chuckled darkly. "You think we're just going to let you go? You're not leaving here until we have answers, and if we don't get them, well, let's just say things will get a lot worse for you." David's heart pounded in his chest. The situation was getting more dangerous by the second, but he couldn't let fear take control. He had to stay calm. He had to protect his family. Outside, David could hear faint voices. His thoughts flickered to Sarah, Billy, and Emma. Were they okay? Were they being treated the same way? The tension inside him grew unbearable, but he knew he had to focus. This was far from over. The officer, with the scar, motioned to one of the others, and they stepped out of the room, leaving David alone for a moment. David's mind raced, thinking of ways to turn this around. The moment they came back, things were going to escalate. What would they do next? The room felt colder now. The flickering lights overhead seemed to hum louder with every passing second, casting long, eerie shadows on the cracked walls. David stood in the middle, his mind racing for any way out, any advantage. He couldn't let these men break him. But the weight of the situation was heavy, and with each passing minute the pressure on him increased. The scarred officer returned with the two others, their expressions hard as stone. David straightened his back, his jaw clenched. His instincts were screaming at him to stay calm and wait for the right moment. But time was running out. He couldn't keep pretending he was just some innocent traveler. These men knew exactly who he was, and they weren't going to let him go easily. The scarred officer locked eyes with him, a smirk creeping onto his face. "You think you can hide behind a badge? You think we don't know who you are? We know exactly what you're capable of, Agent." David's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't said anything about being an FBI agent. But the way the officer said agent, with such certainty, made David realize something chilling. These men were prepared for this. They'd been waiting for someone like him, someone who was part of the system. "I don't know what you're talking about," David said, his voice steady, but a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. Could they have been watching him? Could they have known who he was all along? "Oh, we know," the scarred officer said, stepping closer. "We know more than you think, so here's the deal. You cooperate. You tell us everything we want to know, and maybe we'll let your family go. Otherwise, well, things won't be so easy for you." David clenched his fists, his fingers tingling with the need to fight back. He had to get out of here. He had to protect his family. But he also knew he couldn't let these men see any weakness. The door to the room suddenly opened, and a fourth officer entered. This one was older, with graying hair and a cold, calculating look in his eyes. He carried a folder in his hands and walked straight up to David. Without a word, he opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table toward him. David glanced at the photo. It was a close-up of him, a picture from one of the many FBI files that were meant to stay private. His blood ran cold. How had they gotten this? Who were these people, really? "You've made a lot of enemies, Agent Thompson," the older officer said, his voice low and dangerous. "And we're going to make sure we finish this." David didn't flinch, but his mind raced. This wasn't just a random stop. This was something far bigger than a simple arrest. These men weren't ordinary cops. They had information on him, on his career, his job, his connections. They were targeting him because they knew exactly who he was and what he could do. They were playing a dangerous game. He knew he had to act fast. His training kicked in. If he could just stall them long enough, maybe he could buy time to send a signal to someone, anyone, that something was wrong. He couldn't trust these officers, and he couldn't let them control the situation any longer. David straightened his back, looking the older officer dead in the eye. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said, his voice ice cold. The officer chuckled, clearly not intimidated. "Oh, we know exactly who we're dealing with. You've been a thorn in the side of people much more powerful than us. But you're not going to get out of this. Not this time." David's mind spun, but his heart didn't falter. "You're wrong," he said. "You have no idea who you're messing with." The scarred officer laughed, shaking his head. "Oh, we know, Agent Thompson. We know everything about you. But what we want to know now is how far you're willing to go to protect your family." David felt a chill run down his spine. The threat in the officer's voice was unmistakable. They weren't just after him. They were after everything he cared about. His family, the people he loved. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, they would use Sarah, Billy, and Emma to break him. He couldn't let that happen. With a sudden movement, David slammed his fists onto the table, causing the officers to flinch. "You think I'm afraid of you?" he said, his voice low but fierce. "You think I'm just going to roll over and give up? No, I'll fight you with everything I've got." The scarred officer stepped back, his eyes narrowing. For a split second, David saw doubt in his expression. That was the moment he'd been waiting for. He had them on edge. David didn't wait for them to react. He knew he had to make his move, now. He took a deep breath and, without warning, lunged for the door. He slammed his shoulder into the metal, knocking it off its hinges. The officers scrambled to catch up, but it was too late. David had already broken free. He sprinted down the hallway, the sound of footsteps behind him growing louder. But he didn't stop, not for a second. He had one goal now, to get to his family, to get them out of this nightmare before it was too late. David didn't stop running. His feet pounded against the cold concrete, echoing in the narrow, dimly lit hallways of the building. His breath came in sharp gasps. His mind focused only on one thing: getting to his family. His FBI training kicked in, guiding his movements through the winding corridors. He had to stay ahead of the officers, who were undoubtedly close behind. He had to think fast. The building felt like a maze. Each turn and twist only deepened his sense of dread. He could hear the officers shouting, their footsteps growing louder, but David didn't look back. Every second counted. He had to keep moving. He turned a corner sharply, spotting a door at the end of the hallway. Without hesitation, he sprinted towards it, pushing the door open just enough to slip through. On the other side, the air was fresher, but still tense. The room appeared to be some sort of storage area, piles of old equipment, broken furniture, and boxes stacked high. It wasn't much, but it was a temporary hiding place. David crouched low, his heart racing as he listened. The sounds of pursuit grew closer. The officers were just outside the door. They hadn't seen him yet, but it wouldn't be long before they realized he was no longer where they thought he was. He had to move, and he had to move now. He scanned the room quickly, looking for anything that could help him escape. A large, rusty pipe ran along the ceiling, but it wasn't something he could use to climb. There was a window on the far side, but it was high up, too far for him to reach without assistance. But then he spotted it, a stack of old crates. They were stacked neatly in the corner, piled high. David moved swiftly toward them, dragging a few to the side to create a makeshift ladder. As he began to climb, he couldn't help but think about the family waiting for him, Sarah, Billy, and Emma. They had been dragged into this mess by sheer accident. The officers had no idea who they were really dealing with, and David was going to make sure they never hurt his family again. From his new vantage point, he spotted a small window near the ceiling. It was cramped, the space barely big enough for him to squeeze through. But it was his only chance. His muscles burned as he climbed higher, but David didn't allow himself to think about the pain. He had a family to protect. Just as his fingers grazed the edge of the window, he heard the door slam open behind him. His heart skipped a beat. They were here. One of the officers shouted in frustration, realizing David had escaped. The sound of footsteps pounding on the floor echoed in the room. David didn't hesitate. He pushed himself through the narrow opening, feeling the sharp edges of the window scrape against his skin as he twisted his body to get free. He landed on the ground outside with a thud, the fall not as graceful as he had hoped. But he was out. He looked up quickly. The building was surrounded by thick trees, the shadows creeping over the grass. The night air was cool against his skin, but it felt like a small victory. David didn't waste time. He ran, zigzagging through the trees as fast as he could. The officers had just realized he was outside. The sound of their voices echoed through the night, but David's head was already focused on his next move, finding his family. He couldn't afford to be caught now. The stakes were too high. As David ran through the thick woods, his mind began to race with thoughts of Sarah and the kids. What had they done to them? Were they still being held at that rundown building? Or had they been moved? Then a thought hit him like a wave. They could be holding his family hostage to force him into cooperating. His jaw tightened. He couldn't allow that to happen. He couldn't let them use his family as leverage. David stopped, crouching behind a large tree, peering out through the branches. In the distance, he saw the faint outline of the building, now surrounded by patrol cars. There were several officers, standing guard. His escape had only bought him a few precious minutes, but it was enough to give him a new plan. He needed to get back inside, but this time, it had to be different. He couldn't rely on the same tactics. He couldn't just rush in blindly. He needed to think about his family's safety first. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. There was no time to waste. Every second that passed brought more danger to his family, and David couldn't allow them to suffer because of his mistakes. His fingers flexed, his mind calculating the best course of action. He knew that his family was likely being held in a different part of the building, away from the chaos. But how to get them out? He needed a distraction, something big enough to divert the officer's attention. Suddenly, an idea sparked. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, silently cursing the fact that he had to rely on it in such a dangerous situation, but he needed to contact someone, anyone, who could help. His hand trembled slightly as he typed out a quick message to his contact back at the FBI. He had to trust someone on the outside to help them. David pressed send and hid the phone back in his pocket. He didn't have much time before the officers realized he was outside and started looking for him. His thoughts focused back on his family. They were depending on him. He couldn't fail them. The forest was eerily silent, save for the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. David's heart hammered in his chest, every beat reminding him of the precious time slipping away. He couldn't afford to hesitate. His family needed him, and every second that passed brought them closer to danger. He had already contacted his FBI contact, but there was no telling how long it would take for help to arrive. He couldn't just sit back and wait. His fingers tightened around the strap of his bag, and he crouched lower behind the thick trunk of a tree, taking in his surroundings. The night was thick with shadows, and the only source of light came from the dim glow of the building in the distance. The officers outside were growing more agitated. He could hear their voices now, calling out to each other, no doubt realizing he'd escaped. It wouldn't be long before they came after him. David felt a sudden rush of anger. These men, these so-called officers, had no idea who they were dealing with. They thought they could intimidate him, control him, but they hadn't. Accounted for one thing: the lengths he would go to protect his family. He breathed deeply, forcing his mind to focus. He needed a plan, a good plan. He couldn't just rush in, guns blazing. That would only put his family in more danger. But if he could get inside that building again, if he could find the right moment, he might just be able to turn the tables. David rose slowly, eyes scanning the scene in front of him. The patrol cars were still stationed near the building, but there were fewer officers standing guard now. It seemed they had become complacent, thinking he had disappeared into the night. It was the perfect opportunity. David moved quickly, ducking low to avoid detection. He kept his body pressed against the trees, using their shadows for cover. His thoughts were sharp as he neared the building, his mind calculating each step. The building was more heavily guarded now. The officers knew he was close. He could feel their eyes scanning the dark woods, hunting for him. But David wasn't afraid. He had a plan, and it was all about patience. The officers were looking for someone to charge in recklessly, someone who would give them a reason to escalate the situation. But David wasn't that person. He continued his approach, staying silent, unseen. His breath was steady, his mind clear. Every move was calculated, each step bringing him closer to his family. As he neared the back of the building, David spotted a small side door that was slightly ajar. It was unguarded, and for a brief moment, he hesitated. This was it. The last chance. He had no backup, no reinforcements, and the longer he waited, the more danger his family was in. But the door was his way in. David took a deep breath and slipped through the door, moving quickly into the darkness beyond. The building smelled of old wood and dust. The floor creaked beneath his boots as he moved cautiously through the narrow hallway. His heart pounded as he approached the room where he knew his family was being held. He could hear muffled voices in the distance. Sarah's voice, soft and anxious, echoed faintly through the walls. Billy and Emma were probably scared, too. They had no idea what was happening, no idea how close they were to freedom. But David knew. He could feel it in his bones. The hallway twisted, and soon he found himself at the door of the room where he knew they were being kept. He crouched down, listening intently. The officers inside were distracted, too busy celebrating their supposed victory over him. They hadn't realized they had already lost. David didn't hesitate. He kicked the door open with one swift motion. The officers inside barely had time to react before he was on them. One officer lunged toward him, but David was faster. He grabbed the man by the wrist, twisting it until the officer's weapon fell to the floor with a clatter. Another officer drew his gun, but David was already on him. With a well-placed strike, he disarmed the man, sending him crashing to the floor. The remaining officer scrambled to get away, but it was no use. David was in control now. "Get down!" David barked at the officers, his voice cold and commanding. "This is over." The officers hesitated, looking up at him with wide eyes. But David's presence was enough. They knew who he was now. They knew what he was capable of. "Where's my family?" David demanded, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. His eyes locked on the trembling officers who had no choice but to obey. One of them pointed shakily toward a corner of the room. David didn't waste another second. He moved quickly, crossing the room in a few strides. There, huddled together, were Sarah, Billy, and Emma. They looked up, their faces filled with fear, but also a glimmer of hope when they saw him. "Dad!" Billy cried, rushing toward him. David scooped his son into his arms, holding him tightly. Emma followed, her small arms wrapping around him. Sarah's eyes were filled with relief, but also a lingering sadness. She had been terrified for him, for all of them. "We're getting out of here," David said, his voice soft but filled with determination. "We're going home." He turned to face the officers, who were now kneeling on the floor, their hands behind their heads. They were defeated. The power had shifted, and now David had control. His family was safe, and justice, in one form or another, would be served. The sound of sirens grew louder outside, signaling the arrival of the backup he had called earlier. The FBI was on its way. The officers in the building would be arrested, and they would face the consequences of their actions. But that wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was that David had kept his promise to protect his family. And now they could go home. As the sirens drew closer, David held his family close, knowing that the nightmare was finally over. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The battle might have been won, but the war for justice was far from over.